You guys should give Cate the biggest round of applause. Cate?
Hi, y'all. So obviously it's insane to both host and speak at a conference, right? But you know, Natasha's one of my BFFs, so like literally anything my BFFs ask me for, I will do. But I do have some regrets right now. I'm gonna take these shoes off for starters. All right. It's probably fine though, right? All right. Cool. So before we get started, just a note on raccoons. Who loves raccoons? Okay, only some of you. I'll ask you this question again tomorrow morning. I hope all of you by then love raccoons. So there's this like common thing about engineering management that like people talk about it as herding cats. But you know, I've always felt that it's much more like, you know, trying to really motivate raccoons. So raccoons are just like adorable. They're very smart. Programs are often not adorable, but they are at least mostly smart. Independent, you know, and really just determined to live their best lives. So raccoons has always seemed like a much better metaphor for me. So now all my slides are raccoons. My friend Virginia draws them for me. They're very beautiful. So anyway, similarly to me agreeing to Natasha to both host and speak, which I'm not at all holding against her and expect her to love me for the end of time for, this is a similar approach to my work. And so this is kind of how I ended up becoming a bit of a fixer, you know? I take teams that are struggling and I help them improve. So deliver more, deliver better, and feel happier. But you know, what does that have to do with your team, right? I'm sure most of your teams are probably fine. But how do you know? So if I ask you how good your team is, do you have an answer? Are you sure? What's your frame of reference? Now, in general, almost everybody thinks their team could be better, but almost everybody thinks that their team is mostly fine. But what if I ask you a different question? Like, what if I ask you, how much has your team improved in the past year? Now, how confident are you? So people tend to have much more confidence in how much their team has improved or not at all improved. Sorry, there's a terrible problem here. There we go. So, you know, this is because a lot of stuff when it comes to how teams are operating is entirely contextual, right? So let's take a concrete example. Is 30 story points good? You have no fucking idea, right? It depends entirely on how many story points you did the other sprint, what a story point even is, how many people on the team, what's happened lately. So in teams, a lot of things become clearer when you realize that it's much easier to measure progress than state. And then we can reframe the question, and we're no longer asking how can we be right or what is good. We're asking how can we be less wrong. So then, you know, our question is not, is the team good, but how do teams improve? So I'm just going to reduce my value into capitalism here and tell you that I'm not really a fixer because there is no fixer. When you want to improve a team, it really takes a team. It's an adventure you go on together. And so I'm much more of a facilitator than a fixer. And so today we're going to talk about 4 layers of team functioning, and we're going to ask 4 questions. So there are 4 layers in a team, and so we can think of them in terms of communication, but this is also the work that we do at each level to create clarity and agreement. So mission, the why, strategy, the how, tactics, the what, and execution, the do. Now, the mission or the why is useful only at the point where it tells you not just what you do, but what you don't do. So Automatic, for example, has a mission to democratize publishing, but this is way too broad to be useful for any individual team. So on the mobile team, we talk about making a great experience for mobile only or mobile primary users. So what are we not doing? Well, we're not trying to make computer users happy. The team I run now is called the Developer Experience Team. And we talk about being a support for the entire engineering organization, focused on acting as an accelerant in inflection points in teams and individuals. There's a lot of kind of words there, but there's some key words. So one of them is inflection points. So are we inviting ourselves to everybody's weekly meeting? Absolutely not. And another key word is support. So are we going and dictating to people? Vehemently no. Now, teams without a mission don't know what their purpose is. And their failure mode of a missionless team is this analysis paralysis and kind of abdicating decisions. So how do you determine a mission? Well, it needs to be aspirational, but also within grasp. And now, often the where is handed down. We're going to the moon. But it's on you to extract and articulate the why, and to craft a sentence that captures the purpose and guiding principles of your team. So how important is having a mission? Well, the main benefit is in better decision making, because teams without a mission often kind of spiral and spin from thing to thing, but having a mission doesn't help without everything else. The strategy is the how. And this is made up of proximate objectives. This is a concept that comes from this book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, which I absolutely love. You'll hear more from it later. But the proximate objective is the next achievable goal. So on mobile, when we talked about making what could be great on mobile great, we could break it down. So media can be great on mobile, notifications can be great on mobile, offline can be great on mobile. And then each individual one of these becomes a proximate objective. So most of this year I've been working on scaling our hiring process, and we have a number goal in terms of total number of people we want to hire, but our initial focus was on building out the capacity because it's much more tractable, and once you have that capacity you can push on other levers. Now, strategy is the decisions that are made to deliver on the mission, and if you haven't made the decisions then you can't work towards it. So teams without a strategy struggle to make decisions because almost anything can be declared to support the mission. But, how do you determine the strategy? Well, good strategy requires both depth and breadth. It takes the context of your team, the organization, and the broader world. The thing is that most strategy is bad. A good strategy does more than urges forward towards a goal or vision. A good strategy honestly acknowledges the challenges being faced and provides an approach to overcoming them. And the greater the challenge, the more a good strategy focuses and coordinates efforts to achieve a powerful competitive punch or problem-solving effect. Bad strategy tends to skip over pesky details such as problems. It ignores the power of choice and focus, trying instead to accommodate a multitude of conflicting demands and interests. Like a quarterback whose only advice to teammates is let's win, bad strategy covers up its failure to guide by embracing the language of broad goals, ambition, vision, and values. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Is anybody reading that and being like, shit, that's our strategy, it's bad? So, strategy taken from one place won't work elsewhere, and this is actually the most common failure mode for executive hires. And this can be true even within your organization because absolutely everything is contextual. Strategy is tangible, and progress can be measured. So when we decided to improve the media experience, we could make it concrete. We could identify improvements based on user feedback, looking at other best-in-class media experiences, and it can be measured in metrics around media upload. When we talk about building out capacity and hiring, it's very tangible because we know how many interviews we can conduct in a given week, and we know how quickly someone can schedule in. Now, the most important piece of strategy is what you decide not to do. Some things you might decide not yet, and some things you might decide not ever, but non-decisions are decisions to fail. So, you develop your strategy by looking at the different ways to make progress and making decisions. You need to understand your metrics. So what are the leading metrics for the higher level goal? In hiring, it's so easy because our leading metrics are people at every stage in the process. And in software, it's always been a little bit more challenging, but you can definitely find things like how does your 1 week retention influence your 1 month retention, influence your annual renewal? And your strategy has to fit the team that you have. You might have 10 amazing initiatives, but if you can only staff 2, then you have to choose 2. Because doing everything is not a strategy. And the other thing to think about with your strategy is what would make you change your mind. Like, what information would make you realize that this is not the right thing to do? So you commit, and then you validate and you recommit. Now, tactics are the what. They're the concrete things that make things go. And you can also think of this as the process layer. Now, the tactics make the connection between the strategy and the work of the individual, but it really must be in support of the strategy, because tactics without strategy is just busy work. You know, good process is always in service of an outcome. Now, teams without tactics can't work effectively. Collaboration is hard. It only gets harder at scale. So tactics are like your team APIs that help you manage your integration points between teams and upwards. So how do you determine the tactics? Well, what do you need to know to be effective? What do you need to measure? And also, how is this problem generally solved? It's rare that we need to reinvent processes in engineering teams, but we do need to be selective. Process should never be adopted wholesale, mainly because it won't be adopted wholesale. But often we can look at individual problems and find some standard ways to address them. Now, developers often talk about hating process, but my theory is that developers actually love process. It's just when they love it, they call it culture. So instead of talking about process, you can talk about culture. What kind of culture do you need to be successful? And then you can ask, how do we build that culture? How do we build a culture of collaboration? What would help? Stand-ups, pairing, team calls. How can we build a culture that values users? What would help? User research, support feedback. And how can we build a culture of sustainable delivery? What would help? Regular releases, retrospectives, attention to defects and metrics. Now, these cultural questions will push you to make your processes coherent and supporting of what you want to achieve. So execution is the do. And there's a manager joke that says, if managers call people resources, then they can call you overhead. But the truth is that management is overhead. Everything managers do is in service of people getting stuff done. And execution, this is where the progress is made. Now, without the other layers, it's just activity. But everything else without this is meaningless because nothing happens. So how do you determine the execution? Well, this is super easy, Are there people doing things? And is it clear what needs done? Now, hopefully as I was talking, you were seeing how this could apply to your teams. But it's important that everything fits together. And, few teams do all of these layers equally well. Some people only value execution, which on some level is fair enough because it's the foundation for everything else. But execution is most effective when it fits in a coherent framework. Now, leaders often go to what they're most comfortable with. We've all met and usually disliked the person with a new process for every occasion. Or at the other end of the scale, the person who believes that when they set the vision, normally entirely by themselves, everything is just going to be wonderful. And they're both wrong. All the other layers need to be there for teams to be effective. Because otherwise, the raccoons, they're never going to get to the moon. So I promised you 4 questions. And these don't map to the layers. It's more like a grid. You can ask these on every level. And they are, how do I create clarity? How do I create capacity? What do I want to incentivize? And how are my feedback loops? Now, there's a quote by Tolstoy that says, happy teams are all alike. Every unhappy team is unhappy in its own way. But I don't know that I agree with Tolstoy. Unhappy teams tend to be tediously predictable. They're not delivering, they feel like victims, and they're lost. Now, when you have a struggling team and the first question is where do I begin? You normally, after you've got off the phone to your BFF where you've been going, what have I done? But the most helpful questions are normally, how do I create clarity? And how do I create capacity? So every struggling team I've encountered seems to be experiencing some kind of existential crisis about who we are or what our purpose is, the mission question. But as a pragmatist, this often seems to be kind of beside the point. If we're not shipping, what does it matter what we're not shipping? And how can we possibly know what we should be doing 2 or 5 years from now when we don't have a consistent idea of what we're doing today? So the thing about an existential crisis is that it is comfortable. It is a team bonding experience, normally because it unites a team against a common enemy. Now, uniting against a common enemy is not a good team building strategy, but you really cannot fault it for short-term effectiveness. No one on the team feels threatened by the mission question because it's largely somebody else's problem. And everyone can have an opinion about it because it's abstract enough that most people won't have to do anything to shape or change it. Vision debates are the bike shedding of team purpose and structure. Clarity is harder because it's more immediate and it has to be based on what's happening today. Remember that quote on strategy? Which means you have to confront what's actually happening today. There's no hiding behind a lack of vision. Our team's delivering. Are projects drifting on and on with no end in sight? Are we doing things because they're interesting or because they're actually valuable? The more concrete we get, the harder it is to get everybody in agreement. So a wide range of opinions can find shelter in a broad and fuzzy mission statement in a way that is not possible in a narrow and clear one, the kind that articulates a proximate objective. Clarity involves hard conversations, hard truths, and defining first 1 and then 2 steps ahead. It's hard work that often looks small from the outside. It's no here, no there, refining this, refining that. And it's often stating what at least some people believe to be true anyway, such as what isn't going well, or what the next steps include. But it is the most effective way I've found to get teams to stop drifting and start delivering. Now, what actions you can take to achieve clarity depend on the team, but typically you might take stock of all your ongoing projects as well as the purpose and timeline for each of those projects. What's their strategic objective? You might articulate the current priorities of the team, the purposes of those priorities, and the rationale behind making them priorities. And you might clearly define the scope of upcoming milestones in every current and new project. Struggling teams also commonly suffer from a sense of overload, and often this is very unevenly distributed across the team, so some people seem exceptionally relaxed and some people seem alarmingly overworked. And if you view your team as a system, then you'll see where you have bottlenecks that, if they were cleared, would increase the overall capacity of your team. There's 2 books I really love for this, which is Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows and A Beautiful Constraint. And so again, what you might do depends on what the bottlenecks are. But you might reduce the number of things that you're working on because there's too many people working alone. You might take a more strategic approach to tackling inbound requests because you can't keep playing whack-a-mole. And you might realign people closer to the work that they want to do. And you will also need to get the team to talk about timelines and embrace continuous delivery, because having that force only come externally is invariably destructive. Now, if you manage managers, then improving them as leaders will always create capacity on your team. Their teams will get better and you can rely on them more and delegate more effectively. Sometimes it seems in tech that people feel that they don't have time to coach people, but medium term, not even long term, we don't have time not to. Now you can always come back to these questions because the answers change over time, and there is always a bottleneck. Some level of confusion is just part of the ambiguity of human communication. But it's important to make sure that you're not staying where you're comfortable. There's a different answer for each different layer, but what's most pressing? So it is not a talk on teams without this quote. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think about this in terms of the next 2 questions, which are, what am I incentivizing and how are my feedback loops? So there's a concept of self-managing teams, which I prefer to reframe as self-improving teams. Self-improving teams have feedback loops that make getting better over time a team effort. They respond well to failure because they learn as much as they can from it. They use estimation as a way to surface the known and unknown unknowns. And they invest in collaboration that levels up both individuals and the collective. And the question that might emerge from this is, well, if you do that, what's the role of a manager? Doesn't it render you redundant? And maybe I'm fine with that because I'll get to go back to writing code. But actually, this reframes the role of a team lead as someone who enables the team and acts as an accelerant. It means moving away from the need to control or the feeling that the value you bring comes from the power you have towards a coaching mindset. And the acceptance that the value you bring is shown best in the output of the team and team health rather than anything that you actively and obviously do. Now, every new manager struggles to let go of the individual work that they were doing and presumably achieve some level of mastery at. And it's really hard to enter into this mindset, but it's easy to claim it. Many managers talk about servant leadership, which often either means that they're an ineffective doormat for their team, or they're just uncomfortable with the power they have because you can't be the servant of people you have power over. Managers can also use this as a reason to kind of abdicate responsibility for the day-to-day of the team. Like, responsibility can only be a product of control, although sometimes not even then, and power without responsibility is a form of sociopathy. The best leaders master multiple leadership styles, and they know when they're best deployed. They know when to take the hard line of the authoritative stance. They know when a situation is bad enough that a coercive style is necessary, and when a team would benefit from someone setting the pace. They know when to optimize for the increased buy-in of the democratic approach, and when a team needs an affiliative leader to help them bond. They know when showing up as a collaborator will get the best out of people, and they know when somebody needs a coach. Now, we all have our go-to and our default that we lean on, but it's not appropriate for every occasion. And the more that we can build out capabilities in different styles authentically and deploy them regularly, the more versatility that we have in different situations. The authoritarian leader who suddenly shows up as a coach is probably not going to be trusted, but the affiliative leader who suddenly shows up as authoritative may not be taken seriously. The self-improving team is a place for the democratic and affiliative styles, but above all, the manager is coach and collaborator. And like all good coaches, you need to ask good questions. And like any good collaborator, you need to be willing to get in there and provide active help. Now, in almost every situation, you will get the behavior you incentivize. So if you say you value feedback, but you silence dissent, then you won't hear what people are really thinking. If you say you value simplicity, but you reward complexity, well, you'll get complexity. The gap between claimed values and actual incentives is organizational hypocrisy. Being clear about incentives and rewarding the things that you want to see is key to making sure that teams are aligned. If you want to incentivize collaboration, you can't evaluate purely on individual metrics. And if you want to incentivize honesty, you have to be willing to listen to things that you maybe don't want to hear. If you want to deliver user value, then you have to make sure that you recognize that work. The role of a manager in a self-improving team is to ensure that incentives align with team improvement. Now, people only improve consistently if they get feedback, so feedback loops need to be 1, tight, and 2, positive. And this doesn't just mean feedback about what they can do better, right? Feedback is just someone's work reflected back to them. Making sure that people get consistent feedback and appreciation and incentive for what they're already doing well is really crucial. Giving people only constructive or worse, negative feedback will cause them to avoid you. So if we launch a new feature, we want to set up feedback loops around if anything goes wrong, like downtime, support volume. But it's also important that we set up feedback loops for what we expect to go right, like usage, positive feedback, So the role of a manager in a self-improving team is to build and contribute to healthy, productive feedback cycles. Now, you get what you incentivize, and it really doesn't matter how you feel about that. A friend told me about a company that's no longer celebrating promotions because they don't want people to be so focused on them. And like, sure, but if you've created that kind of culture, the celebration is probably the least of it. And also, who stops people from celebrating? On a good team, there's a strong and coherent communication, and this is a product of psychological safety, as is the ability to treat failure as a learning opportunity. There's a good idea of what can be done and how. This is how teams ship regularly. And they understand why things should be done and why they shouldn't. They make decisions. They have aligned incentives and strong feedback cycles, and this allows developing individuals within the team and creating growth and opportunity. So your team, like my team, well, they're probably fine, right? But they can probably be better too. And the stronger we build our teams, the further we can go. All the way to the moon.